Holy City Center Radio, it is episode 388, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Friday, July 4th, 2025. Happy 4th of July, everyone. Yes, it is Independence Day. If you need some plans, go to holycitycenter.com. You can go to /calendar, which will show you whatever day you access it. That'll be front and center, and you can skip through and look at other days. There should also be, depending on when you're listening to this, there should be a story somewhere at the top of the main page about the latest, 4th of July plans that are, at this point, I doubt there'll be much additions to that, but it's a list of different events that are being held. A lot of them are, your typical fireworks and stuff, but a lot of towns in the area have some other celebrations, like some of the islands have like golf cart parades, including I think West Ashley has one in Shadow Moss, and things like that. So everywhere from things to do during the day, maybe with like little kids, to fireworks at night, and so if you're looking for those plans, head to the website to find more. So however you choose to celebrate, have fun, stay safe, especially if you're going to be using fireworks. Think about your neighbors when it's, maybe you had a couple drinks or something with buddies. You're like, let's shoot out some fireworks after midnight. Maybe don't do that. And also, I know fireworks, they're fun and all that, but, think about pets as well. They get spooked, they get frightened. If you're somewhere where that might be the case, maybe try to go somewhere else. But regardless of what you do, stay safe, think about your neighbors, have fun. And without any further delay, let's get into the reason you're actually here, which is the news. So we've got an update on that Charleston rocking story about shrimp fraud. I poke a little fun at it, but it is a serious issue, as you know, from what we've talked about. I mean, serious. I know when we think about other things going on in the world, this is not very high up, but you get the point. And a lot of people, when that report came out, and I'll recap that in a moment for those who don't remember, a lot of people want to know, okay, which restaurants in town were the ones that said that they were offering local shrimp, and it turns out they are not. And at the time, the firm who did that study did not release those results. But because the results were so poor, some lawyers got involved with the South Carolina Shrimpers Association, and things are continuing to move forward. And earlier this week, they went ahead and named 25 restaurants that were being accused of quote-unquote shrimp fraud. So what exactly is going on here? So for those who don't remember, there was a study that was done by a group, I believe it's pronounced SEAD Consulting, it's SEAD, capital S and a capital D. And it's a company that the Southern Shrimp Alliance had commissioned to conduct some testing. Basically, what they did was they went around to, I think the number ended up being, 44 Charleston area restaurants. They tested their shrimp to see if it actually came from South Carolina waters or not. And then they released their findings. It turned out only 4 restaurants of the 44 had South Carolina shrimp. Now, the others, of those, some had advertised that they had local shrimp, which obviously would be what they're calling this shrimp fraud, lying to your customers. Yeah, we've got local shrimp, and you don't. Others, were just, like businesses that were, on the water. So maybe they didn't expressly say that they had local shrimp, but that would be the implication. I think most people, when they visit, a restaurant on, say, like Shem Creek, they just assume, especially seeing all the boats and things, that we're getting everything local. And then others, just they didn't advertise one way or the other, but they just didn't have local shrimp. Now, they didn't advertise it, so it's a different scenario, of course. So this led to a lawsuit, which has now been amended, and a press conference was held on Wednesday, and they released 25 restaurant businesses, and they in this amended federal lawsuit. So the restaurants that were named are alleged to have been found to be outright fraudulent by actively promoting local or Lowcountry heritage shrimp while serving foreign imports. Now, one restaurant responded to this, and I wouldn't exactly call it foreign import, but it wasn't South Carolina shrimp. We'll get to that in a moment. The lawsuit filed in federal court alleges violations of both the Federal Lanham Act and the South Carolina Unfair Trade Practices Act. So we'll see, what exactly happens as this moves forward. So I'm not going to read all 25 of the businesses. I'm just going to hit a couple of like some really well-known ones. And if you want to see the full list, just visit the link in the show notes and you can see which restaurants are included in this lawsuit. Now, I will say I have only seen one restaurant respond to this. So keep that in mind, and I will talk about that in a moment. And so, just like any other court case, everybody deserves, to be, innocent until proven guilty, even in a case like this. And, so just keep that in mind. And you'll see what I mean when I talk about this other restaurant where things might not be as cut and dry in some instances. So, all right. So some of the groups include, Pearl's Oyster Bar, Page's Okra Grill in Mount Pleasant. They are the ones who had something to say. And we'll get to that in a moment. Hyman Seafood, Charleston Crab House, Saltwater Cowboys, Tavern and Table. Those last two are on Shem Creek, of course. Water's Edge, that's another one. Mill Street Tavern, that's another one. And then there's a few others, including the Wreckfish Bar and Grill, which just opened downtown. And again, there's some more that you can check out. Another kind of one that you would think, hey, maybe they would have local shrimp is Pier 101 on Folly Beach because they're right there on the pier. And so that's some of the businesses. And again, some of those are falling under the category of they're on the water. There's a lot of Shem Creek restaurants that were listed. Did they advertise local shrimp, or did they just fall under that category of they're on the water, so it's a reasonable expectation that they had local shrimp? So that's the kind of stuff that'll be worked out. Now, Page's Okra Grill, that well-known spot in Mount Pleasant, has been open for decades. It's right by Shem Creek, and they're saying they shouldn't have been included in this list. And there are some interesting takes that they put out there, which is I think good to know as we move forward with this whole story. So they went on social media. They had a pretty lengthy response, saying that no, we don't believe we should have been included in this. We're not doing any false advertising. Basically, they explained how the business works and that they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars this year alone on East Coast wild caught shrimp. So they're still coming from, off U.S. waters. It's just not South Carolina necessarily. So is that really, they're not, I wouldn't consider that. I don't think any of you would either. Foreign imports, they're not getting it from some farming operation or some other country. These are still shrimp that the product would fall under U.S. regulations as far as quality control and things like that. So I think that's a really big part of this is, okay, if they didn't advertise showing local shrimp and they just don't have it, is it really that big of a deal if they're not lying to the customers? You may have made an assumption that it was local, but are they really at fault for that, you having that assumption? And on top of that, if it's not South Carolina, but it's still from a U.S. source, is that really that big of a deal to you? Now, don't get me wrong. I would love to think everything came off the waters of South Carolina. Let's support the local industry here. But when you think about how much shrimp places do, that's not always realistic. And that's also another point that Page's Okra Grill made. They said that they use about 3,000 pounds of shrimp a week, and they struggle to find local suppliers that can meet that high demand. So that of course makes sense. If you're a restaurant that is doing that big a business, I mean, local shrimpers just may not be able to handle all of your order. So yeah, could they do a partial order? Sure, of course. But they went on to say that they mostly use East Coast wild caught shrimp. And then when they do go to imported shrimp, they claim they use ones that are responsibly farmed. So, they didn't list the companies, so who knows how true that is. But, hey, benefit of the doubt. And so I think that's an interesting point, both of those aspects to it. If Pages claims that they're not advertising local shrimp, I haven't been in the restaurant, so I can't tell you what the menus say or anything like that. But if they're not advertising it, do they really need to be called out like this? I mean, yeah, it's nice to know which places do have local shrimp. But again, do they really deserve any kind of hate from this if they weren't lying to their customers? And then when a good chunk of that fish is still coming from U.S. suppliers, is it really that big of a deal? restaurants that don't advertise local shrimp and then get it, imported from another country. The issue with that has been, well, some aren't responsibly farmed. They don't have the same quality control or regulations that we have in the US. That can be a little concerning. You would hope that we're getting, the shrimp that meet the quality standards here in our country. So, I want to just keep that in mind. There are definitely restaurants on that list, I'm sure, that have advertised local shrimp in some capacity and just didn't have it for whatever reason, whether that was a temporary thing and they often do have local shrimp, or they never do and they just claim it is. That's far different than possibly some of the other restaurants on this list, if assuming all things Paige's Okra Grill said are true. When you're doing that much business, you might not be able to get everything locally. And is it that big of a deal if it's coming from a US supplier? So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out, how this lawsuit works. It'll be really interesting to see, which restaurants really did egregiously lie to their customers and which just kind of got swept up in this whole thing. But it's a very interesting story. We'll certainly be keeping an eye on this whole shrimp fraud fiasco, and I'll be sure to pass along any updates. We have a challenger for Lindsey Graham, not the first one, but the latest that is announced. And it may be a familiar name if you know anything about South Carolina politics over the last decade plus. Former South Carolina Lieutenant Governor André Bauer is mounting a primary challenge to Lindsey Graham. That means, yes, he's a Republican. And a lot of times with these seats, the two Senate seats, the other one, of course, held by Tim Scott, oftentimes, I should say, the biggest battle is the primary, because this is such a red state that even a popular Dem usually doesn't get close to beating Graham or Tim Scott. So oftentimes the primary is really where the action is. And that could be the case here because he is a known entity. I don't think his name recognition is on the same level as Lindsey Graham, even, in this state. But he's pitching himself as being more conservative than Lindsey Graham, a big-time Trump ally, whereas Lindsey, as we know, although he really is a Trump ally, you have seen him speak out from time to time, and his relationship with Trump kind of ebbs and flows, and he's not always on Trump's top top list. But this could be really interesting. So for those who are unfamiliar, Bauer is a wealthy developer. He's a longtime backer of Trump. He's hoping to oust this four-term senator who, let's be honest, even Republicans aren't really thrilled with Lindsey Graham, but they often just don't vote for anybody else because they're never going to vote for a Democrat. And there's yet to be an interesting, Republican to drum up enough to run against Lindsey. And the fact that Bauer is trying to really lean into his Trump support, that makes it an interesting race because a lot of this, not just the state is red, they're very Trump and MAGA heavy. So it could be interesting. He's describing himself as a real American first conservative. And he says he's intent on representing what he sees as South Carolina conservatives' true values, basically saying Graham isn't conservative enough to run the state, which, yikes. If you don't think he's conservative enough, Bauer sounds like he's ultra conservative if that is actually the case. As far as his political background, he served in the South Carolina legislature before, at age 33, actually. He was elected the youngest lieutenant governor in the country. That was back in 2002. After 2 terms, he mounted an unsuccessful 2010 gubernatorial bid. He finished last in a 4-way GOP primary that was ultimately won by former Governor Nikki Haley. 2 years later, Bauer ran for Congress, but lost a GOP runoff to eventual Representative Tom Rice. That was in, at the time, a newly created 7th district here in South Carolina. So, no, yeah, his history with running these last few times he's run for something, not great, but because he was a lieutenant governor, and if he can really lean into this Trump thing, it could be a really interesting primary. Will he beat Graham? Who knows? Of course, that's also dependent on who else may jump into the primary, but certainly an interesting name and something to keep an eye on. All right, a lot of the talk nationally has been the so-called one big beautiful bill, or whatever the official name that Trump is calling it. And there's been a lot of debate in both chambers and a lot of news reports about some of the bad stuff that is in this bill, and even people who voted for it, like Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, or Josh Hawley in Missouri, have basically said this is a bad bill. Yeah, we shouldn't be cutting things like Medicaid, and then ultimately vote for it anyway. It's not a done deal yet. It's heading that way. But how will this affect people? Well, it's going to be in many ways because there's so many aspects to this bill, and we still don't know what will officially be in there when it passes, if it passes, but it certainly seems like it will. But in its current iteration, tens of thousands of South Carolinians could lose nutrition assistance if this budget bill becomes law. Specifically, we're talking about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP. You may better know it as an older term, food stamps. So obviously, people who need some extra assistance for very important things, food, nutrition, surviving. Now, there are already eligibility requirements in place, but there could be some changes to those if the bill passes, and like I said, in its current iteration. For some more background, SNAP is currently fully federally funded, but if this bill passes, there could be a budget reduction of about $295 billion over a decade. So, no, not right away, but it would, that's a pretty big number, even spread out over a decade. So, we'll zoom in here locally. In the Tri-County area, just shy of 30,000 households, or about 9% of our state's population, currently rely on SNAP benefits. This is according to the state's Department of Social Services data that was put together by ABC News 4. Meanwhile, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimates some 27,000 parents in the state would lose SNAP completely, with another 69,000 slated to lose some sort of allotment, so they will be getting less. Now, a lot of the talk you'll see online is, well, if you don't want to work, you don't deserve SNAP benefits, which of course ignores that there are work requirements, number one, already. And that this isn't just for people who, quote, don't want to work. Because again, there are work requirements. But even if that was true, this is for people who may not physically be able to do so, of course. And so who's going to be affected? Well, we don't really know yet because we don't know what's going to happen. But I can give you some background. To qualify right now, able-bodied adults, so these are people who can work, and adults in this context, it's anyone 18 to 54 years old, must meet work requirements. So they have to work in some capacity to be eligible for these SNAP benefits. If you're older than 54 right now, you would be eligible for them without those work requirements. Doesn't seem so ridiculous to me. Are there a lot of people over the age of 54 that should be working? I mean, yeah, at 54, you're still, pretty young. You can still take part in the workforce and all that, but not everybody. We all age differently. Who knows? Well, one of the changes would be that requirement would now jump to the ages of up to the age, of 64. So it's a 10-year jump. That seems a little different to me. I can sort of get the argument, for someone who's like 55, into their 60s a little bit, depending on how able-bodied they are. And obviously, there are lots of people who work well into their 60s and some beyond because they can and they're able to. And that's great if they can and want to and whatever. But there are going to be a lot of people 65 and older, or I'm sorry, in that 10-year range that they just added to, so 55 to 64, that, maybe realistically can't do it for whatever reason, and it might not be a health situation where they would, they qualify without the work requirements, but, really can't work for whatever reason. And so in that scenario, about 17,000 older South Carolinians would be on track to lose all benefits, and 22,000 more could lose some of their monthly allotment. Now, of course, that they're saying they're on track to lose it because if it, day one, this is implemented, those people who didn't think they had to have a work requirement, in that 55 to 64 range, would lose it. But, some of them may go back to work and whatever they need to do to, so in the end, the numbers might not be that high. And so, when people talk about this, if you're able to work, you should work thing. And I agree in certain age ranges, like there shouldn't be, some like 25-year-old, 30-year-old, whatever it is, 40-year-old who is just sitting at home collecting these SNAP benefits and not trying to work. I get that. But that's, again, there are work requirements. So it's kind of a moot point anyway. But the older people get, I feel like the more lenient some of those work requirements can be. And I know, again, it's dependent on the person. and how their health is and things like that. But, I certainly have no problem with some requirements, but, just taking away a program that's meant to help people who's have a low income for whatever reason, and this is helping them to pay for things like food and necessary things, and you want to take that away from people. That's the part of the bill, like, and we haven't even talked about Medicaid and things like that are going to be cut. um and if there is some sort of, this whole fraud abuse, thing, if there really are those types of things going on, yeah, of course those people should be dealt with, and they shouldn't be getting these benefits. But when there are people who are trying to do the right thing, they're not trying to game the system, which, I mean, come on, how many people do we think are really trying to game the system to get SNAP benefits? I'm sure there's some, but how many are trying to do their best and may lose they may lose the ability to collect these for whatever reason, because there are other changes that could affect people that we're waiting to see what happens when this bill is done. But it's just, I don't understand how this is good politics unless you can come out and say, hey, everyone that's losing this requirement are people that were collecting it, and they show some egregious source of fraud or something ridiculous. You're like, oh wow, no, they definitely shouldn't collect it based on that scenario. But they don't have those scenarios to bring out there, because it's not going to take care of that. At least the current version. It's just going to kick people off because they want to use that money for other things like tax cuts for billionaires and things. It's really disgusting. So I'm hoping there are some changes, but that's the kind of stuff we're looking at now. And as of this recording, the bill is not officially passed through. I think we're back at the House right now. When House to Senate, we're back at the House. And Democrat Hakeem Jeffries just did this marathon, essentially a filibuster, but it wasn't officially that, to try to delay, vote on this. And there's been opportunities for people to continue to call representatives and let them know that you don't want them to vote for this. Now, Nancy Mace is a lost cause. If you're in District 1, I mean, you can still call her, but she's voting for this bill. She doesn't care. But if you live somewhere else, give them a call. Encourage friends who live in places where there's a few GOP reps that are wavering. If you know someone who lives in their district, let them know, and you can contact them. Now, when you hear this, it could be a moot point because they're really trying to get this passed today. We'll see what happens. And by today, I mean Friday, when this episode is released. But again, just something to keep in mind, even if you're a Trump supporter, and I doubt anyone listening is, or, if you're a Republican or moderate or whatever, this is what we're talking about with these things. And I know tough decisions need to be made in bills, but knocking a good chunk of people off of their SNAP benefits, I don't see how that is beneficial to us as a country. And really, it's not, you're not being a good neighbor. You're not being a good person when you're taking away from those who are in need, especially those who aren't doing anything wrong. Well, I'll get off my soapbox now. I think you all understand. And that'll do it for this edition of Holy City Center Radio. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Lindsey Marie Collins with LMC Soundsystem for producing this and every episode of the show, and Tyler Boone, whose music you hear in each and every episode as well. Have a great 4th of July weekend. Stay safe. Have fun. Think about your neighbors when you're doing fireworks and all that stuff. But yes, have a great weekend. I'll be back with you next week. Until then, good night and good luck.